Greetings, kindred spirits. Tonight, we embark upon a deliberate descent into the austere, ceremonious, and often mercilessly rigid realm of feudal Japan, a civilization forged on uncompromising codes, unflinching honor, and an ever-present blade. This was a world where the fragrance of cherry blossoms masked the scent of spilled blood, where verse and death could coexist in the same breath, and where a single misstep in etiquette might carry graver consequences than any battlefield defeat. Before we journey inward, I invite you to take a breath, dim the lights, summon a subtle hum from a nearby fan, and consider offering your support. Subscribe only if you find solace in the narratives I share. Drop a comment below, letting me know where you're watching from and what hour the clock strikes for you. It always humbles me to see who gathers across the oceans for these quiet explorations. Now, let us exhale the present and step into a time where destiny wasn't chosen, it was inherited. In this stratified world, you awoke not to opportunity, but to a role dictated by your ancestors' bones. Society did not ask who you wished to become. It branded you, bound you, and dared you to disobey. Should fortune place you in the cradle of a samurai lineage, congratulations or condolences, you now bore the unrelenting burden of the blade and the bow, expected to embody valor and precision in every breath. From the position of your kneel to the sharpness of your silence, all was measured. There was no leeway, only legacy. If instead you were born of peasant blood, your fate was far more corporeal. You would toil endlessly in fields that turned to marsh beneath your feet, enslaved to the soil, your future and your children's futures etched in calloused hands and taxed rice, attempting to hoard a portion to survive, treason, attempting to rise above your station, blasphemy. In this world, social mobility was not a dream, but a heresy. The societal hierarchy was carved in stone: samurai, peasant, artisan, merchant, and to transgress this order was to challenge the very fabric of the cosmos. You didn't climb the ladder here, you knelt before it, and then there were the eta, the untouchables, those consigned to occupations involving death, butchery, execution, leatherwork, essential yet invisible. They were spectral laborers, ghosts in the flesh, necessary for the machinery of society, yet cast from its graces. Even within castes, hierarchies festered. Consider the merchant. One might assume wealth garners respect. Not here. In feudal Japan, prosperity attained without physical toil was deemed spiritually corrupt. Efficiency equated to moral deficiency. Meanwhile, the peasantry bore the cruel paradox of providing the rice, only to be starved by their own success. Starvation was not always from famine. It was often fiscal. As for the samurai, despite their reverence, they lived shackled by the minutiae of decorum. To sneeze at an inopportune moment could offend one's lord, dishonor one's ancestors, and bring disgrace upon generations. Their existence was not one of freedom, but of exquisite constraint. And the women, the women, were seldom granted agency. Regardless of class, their autonomy dissolved at the threshold of patriarchal will. Marriage was not a union of choice, but a transaction of obedience. If they were fortunate, they might be permitted to compose poetry, a small bloom in a garden of restrictions. In this intricate theater, you were born draped in costume, given a script, and shoved onto a stage where improvisation was sin. Exquisite, yes. Soul-stifling, absolutely. And this suffocating elegance, was all before morning tea. You might imagine such a world as filthy, but Japan's reverence for cleanliness bordered on sanctification. Hygiene was not mere practice, it was a ritual of moral magnitude. But don't romanticize it. There were no warm tiles or scented soaps. Instead, dawn greeted you with glacial water, fetched from distant wells, poured into stone basins where you cleansed in penance, not pleasure. Soap, a luxury. If accessible, it reeked of ascetic invention. Charred ash, fermented bran, devised by monks as a spiritual trial. In rural hamlets, the bathhouse served as the nucleus of purification, a communal crucible where villagers, nude and wordless, shared warmth and water with landlords, in-laws, and rivals alike. You scrubbed first, then soaked. To sully the bath's waters was a social sacrilege. For those without such access, cleanliness became an improvisational art. Twigs for toothbrushes, salt for polishing teeth, garments aired in sun and silence. The motivation? Not fashion, not wellness, but fear. Fear of spiritual defilement and public disgrace. And for the samurai, this scrutiny intensified. Their lords might inspect them without notice. A single untidy fingernail, a crease in the robe, an odor out of place. Any of these minor infractions could be seen as an affront to the divine order. Women, within the intricate tapestry of feudal Japan, were expected to embody the delicate fragrance of cherry blossoms and the stern austerity of discipline itself. Hygiene was no mere routine, it was ritualized sanctity. Skincare resembled a military campaign in its precision, and hairstyling became a test of endurance, often requiring hours to craft elaborate coiffures. Only so one might wield a rice mortar with the gravitas of a court lady. Yes, cleanliness reigned supreme, immaculately so, but its cost was exacting. Frigid ablutions, interminable grooming, and the ever-present psychological weight of judgment, particularly regarding the pristine state of one's feet. Let us now pivot to those born into the warrior aristocracy, the samurai. On the surface, it sounds enviable. Embroidered robes, poetically named swords, and duels beneath the petals of cherry trees. But beneath that aesthetic ideal lies a codified nightmare. Being a samurai was not about cinematic swordplay or impassioned cries for justice. It was a perpetual, high-wire act over the abyss of disgrace. Life operated under the immutable dictates of Bushido, the way of the warrior, a moral architecture so unyielding it cast a shadow backwards into the grave. You did not exist for yourself. You were the vessel of your daimyo's will. His slightest whim dictated the tides of your fortune. His moods were your barometer. Your loyalty? Absolute, to the point where a disgraceful whisper warranted self-execution. To transgress, be it through insubordination, inelegance, or even an inopportune glance during a tea ceremony, invited not rebuke, but obliteration. Dishonor was not a stain, it was a terminal diagnosis, and the prescribed remedy, seppuku, a theatrical yet harrowing rite of self-disembowelment, performed to salvage dignity and appease ancestral expectations. This was not aberrant, it was institutional. A disgraced samurai might be handed a blade and a quiet room with little more than the phrase, "You understand what must be done." Training was incessant. The samurai was expected to be master of blade, bu, steed, strategy, and verse, while maintaining an impassive expression that suggested profound inner fortitude and absolutely no familiarity with joy. Laughter, crass. Emotion, weakness. Hesitation, fatal. Every aspect of their existence, posture, clothing, scent, silence, was measured with surgical scrutiny. The blade remained spotless, the comportment faultless, and if, by misfortune or momentary folly, a samurai drew his sword in unjustified wrath or suffered defeat in combat, he didn't merely lose honor, he forfeited identity, ancestry, and life. Glory was not the reward. Endurance without falter was. Being a samurai meant wearing armor not just of steel, but of absolute restraint. One misjudged blink, and your legacy shattered. Now, suppose the fates were less theatrical with you. No ancestral blade, no courtly poetry, no dramatic entitlements. Good news, no ritual suicide. Bad news, you're a peasant, a creature of mud, sweat, unrelenting toil, and tribute. You rise with the sun, not due to some poetic connection with nature, but because the imperial land levy waits for no one. Your home is a thatched assemblage of damp wood and straw, entirely porous to wildlife and nosy neighbors. Doors are theoretical, privacy, a myth. Breakfast, if fortune smiles, is a thin gruel accompanied by something pickled into unrecognizability. If not, you sip water and pretend that hunger is a meditative state. Then begins your pilgrimage to the rice paddies, idyllic only in tourist brochures. In truth, these are mud-laden trenches, engineered to siphon the strength from your bones, hour by hour, season by season. You plant, you weed, you pray for a day without bandits, all while your spine slowly calcifies from labor. Upon return, exhausted and sodden, you may discover your child is missing, and the village magistrate wants an urgent word about your rice quota, which you've already met, unless his nephew's cavalry exercise trampled it. Taxation is carnivorous. You are compensated not with coin, but with conditional survival. What little grain remains after tribute feeds your kin if the harvest is generous? If not, you fast and hope the gods prefer suffering in silence. Complaints are amusing at best, punishable at worst. A whisper of defiance may earn you flogging, exile, or the distinct privilege of being an example to others, hanged quietly. Should you ascend the hierarchy and become a village elder, your wisdom will be ceremoniously sought and ceremoniously ignored. You are still tethered by law. You may not leave the village without explicit permission. You are, in essence, a sentient unit of agricultural production, imprisoned by both custom and soil. There are moments of reprieve, festivals, imbibed rice wine, collective dances in dust-choked circles. You laugh because the drums drown out the dread that planting season resumes in 4 days. You are the backbone of the empire, the tiller of its nourishment, and paradoxically, the one the empire chooses not to see. And no, leisure is not an option. Feudal Japan esteems relentless labor, inherited hardship, and the art of managing one's expectations into the ground. You're famished, naturally. You've been toiling, planting, perspiring, and courteously evading death since the break of dawn. Now, it's mealtime, not a celebration, but a necessity. In feudal Japan, sustenance is not about gratification. It's about endurance, austerity, and not perishing in disgrace mid-bite. If you're a peasant, your gastronomic fate is monotonous. Rice. Dawn to dusk, rice. If fortune smiles, it's genuine. If not, it's coarse barley, masquerading as its superior. Perhaps a lonely turnip graces your bowl. A pickled radish, if providence permits. Meat? That's a daimyo's indulgence. Or occasionally, the fate of a disrespectful chicken that stared a little too long. Fish might appear, dried, salted, and sharp enough to double as cutlery. Soup, usually miso, resembles seasoned seawater with the occasional aquatic leaf drifting through. Flavorful, yes, if you consider brine a delicacy. As for samurai, their plates are finer, but the timing is less so. They dine only after their lord, his entourage, and anyone he seeks to flatter. What remains is tepid rice, lukewarm broth, and the solemn privilege of observing others eat while performing the theater of gratitude. Seasonality dictates the menu, not by fashion, but by necessity. There is no refrigeration, no intercontinental trade routes. If you didn't cultivate it, it doesn't exist. Winter is less a season and more a prolonged suggestion to fast. Fall ill from a meal? Medical intervention is optimistic at best. The prevailing remedy? Lie flat, ponder your ancestors, and either recover or join them. Stealing a bowl of rice isn't a petty offense. It's an express route to public punishment, a cautionary tale acted out on a stage of bamboo and consequence. Tea does exist, but not in the whimsical, porcelain clinking form you imagine. The tea ceremony is a meticulously choreographed performance of posture, reverence, and philosophical humility. It's less about quenching thirst and more about mastering existential etiquette. Thus, meals are sacred, silent affairs, more ritual than repast. They're modest, largely flavorless, and reliably include at least one enigmatic, overly crunchy component. And no, voicing complaints is ill advised. Not unless you're curious how soup tastes when served via nostril. So, you've completed your modest bowl of mysterious seaweed stew. Someone utters something preposterous. Perhaps your lord recites a haiku of questionable merit, or your elder misquotes Confucius. Maybe your neighbor claims his ox forecasts the weather. For a perilous, foolish instant, you consider correcting them. Don't. In feudal Japan, voicing an opinion is hazardous. Free expression is not a concept. It's a fast lane to disgrace, banishment, or spontaneous decapitation. The social hierarchy is immovable, and every syllable is weighed. Speak beyond your station, and you're insubordinate. Criticize your superior, insolent. Tell a joke that stumbles, that borders on sedition. Even within the home, words are curated with surgical precision. Sons don't interrupt fathers, wives don't correct husbands, and absolutely no one questions the daimyo, unless, of course, they've long yearned to explore the afterlife via katana. Samurai are schooled in the art of composure. They speak with deliberate stillness, even while seething. A sharp tongue is more perilous than a dull blade. It invites dishonor, retaliation, or a duel that ends with you folded like yesterday's kimono. Apologies here are not verbal footnotes, they're theatrical performances. You don't merely apologize, you bow, you plead, you may even compose a poetic lament of your misstep. Gifts are offered, perhaps a living bird or an ornate comb, while fervently hoping the recipient doesn't respond by removing your head from its shoulders. And heavens protect you if your tone is too casual. A misjudged inflection could be construed as mockery, rebellion, or spiritual contamination. Silence, in this world, is not cowardice, it's a survival strategy. Even humor, treads a narrow, precarious path. Laugh at the wrong remark, and you're disrespectful. Laugh with someone too important, and you risk implying equality. And that, in feudal Japan, is a mistake best not survived. And that, dear observer, is precisely how individuals find themselves mysteriously reassigned to the bleak, frost-bitten reaches of the northern provinces. Technically, yes, you possess the liberty to speak, but in application, you smile with strategic politeness, nod with rehearsed enthusiasm, and silently pray that your unsolicited opinion remains incarcerated within the walls of your teeth. For in feudal Japan, a careless utterance doesn't merely scuttle naval vessels, it eviscerates reputations, annihilates social standing, and in particularly egregious cases, imperils your entire bloodline. In this world, fashion is not a conduit for personal expression, it is an embroidered announcement of one's station. Your garments do not embody your character. They declare your hierarchical placement, your occupational function, and whether you're lawfully permitted to carry a blade without immediately becoming the unfortunate subject of a disciplinary laceration. Let us ascend to the apex of this sartorial pyramid. The samurai, ever the embodiment of calculated dignity, adorn themselves in layered silks, often interwoven with armor, and always arranged to exude cultivated authority. Their wardrobe palette consists of somber indigos, earthen ochres, and the occasional sanguine flourish, a visual whisper that one has ended lives for far lesser transgressions than a mismatched sash. And then there is the daisho, the paired long and short swords. This is not a mere accessory, but a portable insignia of dominion. Unsheathing it in public is reserved for moments of dire necessity. Wearing it incorrectly, however, is an open invitation to be corrected, publicly, painfully, and without further discussion. By contrast, peasants wrap themselves in coarse cotton and inherited modesty. Their garments are steeped in the hues of toil, mud browns, ashen grays, and the uninspired beige of fabrics, undyed and unapologetically practical. Not out of stylistic choice, but because dye costs coin, and coin is for survival, not aesthetics. Their attire says, yes, I labor in soil. No, I did not select this life. And yes, these are indeed my only sandals. Merchants, intriguingly, wealthy yet socially subordinate, dress with delicate restraint. They possess the means for luxury, yet wield it with caution. Their silk is subdued, their embroidery whisper thin. They've mastered the fine art of appearing affluent, yet not so much that a passing samurai deems them in need of a lesson in humility. Artisans and craftsmen embrace attire that is neither flamboyant nor impoverished, functional, durable, and above all, unremarkable. In this society, visibility is risk, and flamboyance is tantamount to insolence. As for women, their wardrobe is a labyrinth of encoded symbolism. They must navigate a treacherous aesthetic terrain, balancing elegance with obedience while cocooned in 12 meticulously folded layers of seasonal, social, and spiritual meaning. Hairstyles are a social dialect. Kimono patterns denote the time of year, family status, and the ever-shifting whims of propriety. An ill-chosen color isn't merely a fashion mistake, it's a public disgrace and an invitation for whispered scandals to bloom like mold behind paper walls. Thus, attire transcends fabric. It is ritual, it is rank, it is an omnipresent test of your ability to remain judged and survive the verdict. Now, perhaps you imagine moon-kissed promenades beneath blooming cherry trees, secret verses whispered beneath lantern light, or a fateful embrace between a wayward samurai and a noble maiden. Allow me to shatter that illusion. In feudal Japan, romantic affection is at best a narrative embellishment, and at worst, a liability. Marriage is not the culmination of passion, but a calculated transaction. Its currency, land, lineage, harvest, yields, and familial reputation. For the peasantry, marital unions are orchestrated by parents and occasionally a particularly meddlesome village elder. Emotional compatibility is a distant concern. Strong limbs and functional teeth tend to hold greater value. Among the samurai class, matrimonial arrangements are tools of diplomacy. Your spouse is not a soulmate, but a political offering. Marriages serve to cement clan alliances, extinguish feuds, or realign the delicate architecture of regional power. The objective isn't joy, it's endurance, preferably the kind that doesn't unravel by mid-harvest. Yes, love letters exist, but only those crafted in immaculate brushstrokes, saturated with metaphor, and covertly transferred via a household servant whose silence is worth its weight in jade, and heaven forbid a misplaced inkblot suggest impropriety. For women, autonomy in romance is virtually non existent. A samurai daughter may be pledged in matrimony by 15. She is expected to master the delicate disciplines of calligraphy, decorum, needlework, and most crucially, the art of silently enduring disappointment. Her duties? Bear sons, pour tea with celestial grace, and most certainly never fall in love with the flute instructor. Romantic love, the unrestrained, fervent, soul-bearing variety, is relegated to the realm of fictional tragedies, poetic yearning, and ghostly ballads told after dusk. In feudal Japan, love is a luxury few can afford, and fewer still dare pursue. If one desired to encounter love within the rigid confines of feudal Japan, one would be better served watching a melancholic, no drama featuring ill-fated lovers who ultimately dissolve into fog and regret to deviate from one's socially sanctioned relational framework was not merely frowned upon, it was a flirtation with annihilation. Adultery was not a scandal, it was a capital offense. Its consequences ranged from exile and irreparable disgrace to a swift, honor-bound dissection, courtesy of a spouse, an irate feudal lord, or in-laws with disturbingly prompt reflexes, whichever arrived first. Even among the samurai class, where the taking of concubines was a normalized institution, this merely multiplied the number of individuals one was expected to disappoint with silent composure. Yes, people did fall in love, furtively, agonizingly, often with entirely unsuitable companions, and invariably at moments of catastrophic inconvenience. For in feudal Japan, love was not expressly prohibited, it was simply catastrophically untimely. Here, death is not an abstract eventuality, it is a constant, familiar presence, a silent tenant in every household. It is your neighbor, your overseer, your persistent companion who contributes nothing to rent but everything to anxiety. Retirement is not envisioned. One prepares instead for a dignified departure. Mortality in this society is not tragedy, it is choreography. Let us commence with the samurai. These austere warriors carry not only a pair of swords, but also a meticulously scripted demise. Should they falter in battle, seppuku. Should they insult their honor, seppuku. Should a drop of sake be spilled upon the daimyo's sleeve, seppuku, preferably accompanied by appropriately mournful shamisen music. And this is not a solitary act. It is public, ritualized, and executed with the same ceremonial gravitas as a tea gathering, albeit with a considerably more internal hemorrhaging. Do not, however, presume that the peasantry is afforded greater longevity. Should the rice harvest fail, starvation swiftly follows. Should the village falter in meeting its tax obligations, heads may roll, not metaphorically, but literally, and with theatrical efficiency. Drought, plague, marauders, choose your preferred harbinger of sudden oblivion. Medical science, a delicate blend of warm herbal infusions and unwavering hope. Speaking of bandits, they are not folklore, they are omnipresent. They care not for your year's labor, your prized radishes, or your hope for a quiet life. The roads beyond your hamlet are perilous to the point of parody. The phrase, "Perhaps we'll visit your cousin next year," is in truth a veiled declaration of one's desire to continue existing. And if you're a woman, childbirth resembles a gamble in a high stakes game with poor odds. Complications are often fatal. Midwives offer wisdom, yes, but surgical intervention amounts to fervent prayer and reheated towels. Should your husband perish in dishonor, cultural expectations may compel you to accompany him, not in sentiment, but in steel. Nature itself is mercilessly creative in its threats: earthquakes, floods, typhoons, tsunamis, crop failures. Japan, in this era, is less a nation and more an avant garde disaster installation. Homes may vanish in a night. Survival is not guaranteed. It is negotiated with every passing season. Insurance, as a concept, consists of a tightly bound roof and an even tighter acceptance of fate. But perhaps most somber is the cultural mandate to meet all this with equanimity. Panic is unbecoming. Hysteria is a stain upon one's legacy. A true exemplar greets mortality with bowed head, composed verse, and the stoicism of someone attending a particularly uncomfortable family banquet. Indeed, feudal Japan is mesmerizing in its elegance, but here, death is not hidden. It is embroidered into the very fabric of daily life. And as for modern ideals, forget them. The exhortations to follow your dreams, to be your authentic self, or to live your truth, these are alien concepts, foreign luxuries. In feudal Japan, your truth is whatever your clan permits it to be. Individuality is not celebrated, it is pathologized. You are not a singular cosmic entity blazing a solitary trail. You are a humble twig on an ancient ancestral tree, and your paramount duty is to avoid becoming the reason that tree is set ablaze in the court of public shame. Your name, your identity, your destiny, all are subsumed beneath the weight of familial obligation. It is not a life, it is an inheritance of duty. Even the esteemed samurai, those paragons of valor and resolve, do not fight for self glorification. They wield their blades in service of their daimyo, their house, their ancestors, and should they perish, it must be in such a manner that reflects luminous honor upon all superiors. For to die bravely is commendable, to die clumsily and thereby cause embarrassment is the stuff of ancestral shame and posthumous ridicule. Your behavior is not yours alone. It is an echo, a reflection not only of yourself, but of your father's dignity, your grandfather's deeds, and perhaps even the ancestral discretion that determines whether your third cousin is received with courtesy or contempt 2 provinces away. This isn't guilt by association, it is existence by entanglement, contemplating a noodle shop out of sheer culinary passion. How charmingly naive. Regrettably, your lineage specializes in equine husbandry, so you'll be grooming hooves and inhaling hay dust until your aspirations are thoroughly extinguished. Curious about painting? Splendid. You'll be silently embellishing the local temple your family patronizes, adhering to every canonical directive without a whisper of personal flourish. And under no circumstances must you court scandal. A single misjudged affair, an inebriated misstep, or an impudent verse recited too loudly could trigger an avalanche. Your siblings ostracized, your mother irrevocably ashamed, your great uncle ceremonially eviscerated just to salvage the family's social capital. You are not an individual. You are a proxy, a movable piece on an intricate dynastic board, and a potential public relations catastrophe in a kimono. But should you adhere strictly to your designated role, bow at prescribed angles, and wed as instructed, your clan may, in hushed tones, utter your name with something approximating approval. And in the grand ledger of feudal Japan, that constitutes a personal triumph. Suppose you've survived the caste labyrinth, dodged the blade of dishonor, fulfilled your rice tax quota, and still drawn breath. Congratulations. Now try contending with the climate. Feudal Japan is, visually, a marvel. Snow-draped summits, placid groves, cascades of sakura blossoms, and meteorologically, an unending siege. The terrain is idyllic, the elements homicidal. Begin with typhoons, elemental deities in tantrum mode. They descend with cyclonic wrath, shredding rooftops like parchment, converting footpaths into streams, and transforming months of rice cultivation into floating detritus. Earthquakes arrive uninvited, violent and capricious. No sirens, no preamble, merely a subterranean murmur, followed by disorientation, and then your home is reclining on its side like a drunken noble. Survive that, and flames await. Structures are crafted almost entirely of timber, including the poor decisions that preceded their construction. Fires devour entire districts with terrifying efficiency. Floods, commonplace, a little too much. Rainfall in your village transmutes into a broth of mud, ruined harvests, and wandering livestock. Your landlord, naturally, still demands his due, now with late fees. Droughts bring the antithesis: scorched earth, parched paddies, and a sun so remorseless it turns fields to fissured wastelands. You offer incense, chant appeals to divine ears, and eye your neighbor's well like it contains liquid salvation. Winter is not a poetic snowscape, but an ordeal in prolonged hypothermia. Blankets are threadbare, fires extinguish before midnight. Central heating is a foreign fantasy. Warmth, when found, is shared misery huddled around smoldering clay braziers. And lest we forget, Japan lies atop the volatile ring of fire. Volcanoes erupt sporadically, showering ash upon entire prefectures, turning shrines into molten sculptures, and providing fresh material for stoic resignation. There is no emergency relief, no cavalry of bureaucrats. If your domicile crumbles, you rebuild it. If your granary spoils, you endure hunger. If the estate of your daimyo also suffers, taxes are still owed naturally. Calamity, after all, is not a valid excuse. In this land, nature is not a backdrop. It is an ever-present antagonist, an unpredictable reminder that even the gods, on occasion, have particularly vengeful moods. And then there is the architecture of power. In feudal Japan, authority trickles downward like an unrelenting waterfall, as do obligations, burdens, and culpability. Think you matter? Reconsider. A peasant answers to the village headman, who bows to the local samurai, who serves the daimyo, who bends to the shogun, who may or may not be acknowledged by the emperor, a spectral figure swathed in ceremonial silks, haunting the capital like a silent deity, more than a sovereign. Even the samurai, resplendent, sword-bearing avatars of martial tradition, are not sovereign beings. Their existence is tethered to orders, to land they do not own, to wars they did not initiate, and to victories from which they derive no direct reward. In this elaborate tapestry, the threads are woven tightly, and the design permits no fraying. In theory, they command reverence. In practice, they are resplendently robed functionaries, upper-tier bureaucrats brandishing katanas with managerial precision. The daimyo, ostensibly formidable lords, presiding over provinces and personal armies, may appear sovereign until the shogun determines their confidence has grown inconveniently bold. Then, surveillance becomes routine, correspondence mysteriously intercepted, and their political aspirations are elegantly separated from their heads. Even the shogun himself, de facto sovereign, supreme military administrator, and grand orchestrator of national order, is not exempt from unease. His dominion demands constant vigilance. The imperial court murmurs behind painted screens. Rival clans plot in shadow. The economy teeters. And at least 4 extended relatives are undoubtedly scheming to add a special touch to his evening tea. He rules, yes, but tranquility is never guaranteed. As for the emperor, he technically occupies the zenith of the hierarchy, yet wields less influence than a decorative artifact in a temple alcove. He is revered but politically neutered, a sanctified presence who names eras, sanctifies ceremonies, pens melancholic verse, and very possibly struggles to pay for his own court robes. He is less a ruler than a breathing emblem. This social architecture is not a ladder one climbs, it is a lattice of immobility. You are inserted into your rank like a meticulously pruned bonsai, trained to endure, not to grow. Ambition here is not a virtue, it is a warning sign. The loftier your ascent, the sharper the blades awaiting your misstep. Deference is mandatory in all upward interactions. Authority descends with absolute gravity. Orders are not suggestions, they are sacred decrees. Disagreements are not debates, they are invitations to vanish. And if you dare suggest you've outgrown your station, what you possess is not ambition, it is a suicidal form of delusion, dressed impeccably. Thus, wherever you stand, be you peasant, merchant, samurai, or provincial lord, know this: someone above you scripts your destiny, and someone beneath you is rehearsing for your collapse. In feudal Japan, intellectual access is doled out according to one's rung on the social hierarchy. Spoiler: the lower your placement, the more elusive and sometimes entirely flammable the latter becomes. Let us begin at the top. Samurai progeny are the pedagogical elite. From early youth, they are immersed in literacy, calligraphy, martial discipline, poetic cadence, equestrian command, archery, decorum, and the sacred art of appearing unimpressed in all situations. By 14, a samurai youth can compose a death poem with exquisite subtlety. You, at that age, were still deciphering the logic of cursive. Their curriculum is not merely academic, it is a blueprint for survival, honor, and unswerving allegiance to the clan. They pore over Chinese philosophical treatises, memorize the tenets of Bushido, and are taught to bow with such reverent precision that celestial beings might pause to take note. Children of artisans and merchants receive more utilitarian instruction. They learn arithmetic, account ledgers, and elementary literacy only insofar as it serves their commercial endeavors. Confucian doctrine is replaced with commodity pricing. Your intellectual horizon is limited to calculating the wholesale margin on fermented radish. For peasant children, education is a euphemism for labor training. Here's a hoe. That's rice. Begin toiling before the sun beats us to submission. Your scholastic mentors are your parents, who teach you how to endure, sow, reap, and perish politely in the presence of a tax collector. Literacy is a rarity. Formal schooling is a fantasy. The only scroll you'll engage with is the one nailed to a tree, typically bearing notice that your taxes have been magnanimously increased. As for girls, unless born into a household of exceptional stature, structured education is almost non existent. Instead, they are rigorously instructed in domestic harmony, sewing, etiquette, tea ceremony execution, and the quiet fortitude required to run a household without uttering an unsolicited opinion. If fate is indulgent, she may learn a touch of poetry or brushwork, provided it doesn't interfere with folding linens at a spiritually appropriate angle. Education in this epoch is not an avenue for intellectual liberation, it is a mechanism of social conformity. One learns not to question, but to perform. The notion of academic pursuit for pleasure would likely cause a respected elder to faint mid-sip into his ceremonial sack. So yes, knowledge is power, which is precisely why it is so meticulously hoarded. Feudal Japan dazzles the eye with aesthetic precision. The arc of a fan, the angle of a teacup, the placement of a flower, all orchestrated to stir serenity and earn ancestral applause. But be warned, every gesture, every motion, every decorative flourish is a potential misstep, and missteps, in a society of measured perfection, are rarely forgiven. Culture within feudal Japan transcended mere artistry. It was performance art rendered with the weight of consequence. The manner in which one arranges chrysanthemums, pours a ladle of tea, or folds the layered silk of a kimono was not left to whim or aesthetic preference. It adhered to ceremonial prescriptions older than most ancestral lineages. One misplaced blossom could tarnish a reputation, making you the subject of hushed scandal across the village, not in a coquettish way, but with the chilling efficiency of social exile. Consider the tea ceremony, a ritual that to the uninitiated appears serene and meditative. In truth, it is a social gauntlet wrapped in grace. Every gesture is codified. Every second is sacred. The guest must kneel with mathematical precision, rotate the cup exactly twice, murmur humble gratitude, and imbibe in contemplative silence, all while internally spiraling over whether they bowed an instant too soon, a beat too late, or with unseemly fervor. A minor misstep is not merely faux pas, it may be construed as a spiritual deficiency or evidence of ancestral shame. Then there is calligraphy, often romanticized as a form of artistic release. It is nothing of the kind. It is a crucible for self-control, an X-ray of the soul's composure. The brush stroke is not ink upon paper. It is the manifestation of inner equilibrium. Sloppy penmanship, one might as well wear a placard, reading emotionally erratic and ill-versed in humility. Even poetry, seemingly benign, is fraught with peril. You do not simply compose a haiku. You must pen it in the correct season, on the appropriate type of parchment, using metaphor delicate enough to suggest emotional depth, yet restrained enough to avoid impropriety. Too blunt, and you are unsophisticated. Too aloof, and you're a frostbitten cynic. Too clever, and now you're peacocking and disinvited from the next moon viewing soiree. Cultural engagement in this epoch was not for leisure. It was an ongoing audition for social legitimacy. One participated not to find joy, but to demonstrate restraint, serenity, and an abject fear of appearing uncultivated. Beauty, in this world, was not effortless. It was warfare in silk, etiquette as armor. And should your ikebana arrangement violate a sacred principle, may the spirits show mercy upon your bonsai, because society will not. Having traversed the trials of hierarchy, sanitation, ceremonial honor, and an omnipresent sea of rice, let us speak plainly. You wouldn't last a single day in feudal Japan, not due to weakness or indulgence, but because this was not a civilization sculpted for personal flourishing. It was one engineered for unyielding precision, ceremonial obedience, and subdued endurance. Each moment constituted an assessment of posture, of allegiance, of whether your bow dipped to the exact prescribed angle while uttering a seasonally appropriate greeting in the tonality expected of your station. Miscalculate, and the repercussions were real. Best case, public humiliation. Worst case, ritualized death, dressed in propriety. There were no days off, no celebration of authenticity. You were born into a role, handed a lifelong script, and expected to perform it with mortuary grade seriousness. Deviation was not considered brave. It was seen as a destabilizing force. The individual did not matter. The clan did. The lord did. The land did. If you were samurai, you bore the suffocating gravity of inherited honor and the looming possibility of having to compose a farewell poem before ceremonially disemboweling yourself. If you were a peasant, you sculpted the earth from dawn until your spine resembled a question mark, praying the sky would not turn against you, nor your masters. If you were a woman, your existence was an intricately choreographed exercise in elegance, silence, and sacrificial diligence. And if you were someone else, well, the entire system was calibrated to ensure you remained precisely who you were. Feudal Japan was exquisitely composed. Yes, an aesthetic marvel. Architecture, like frozen poetry. Rituals, imbued with reverence. Art, painstakingly curated to the last grain of pigment. But this beauty was laced with peril. It demanded a rigidity of spirit capable of fracturing bones. It required submission so total it rendered personal identity almost heretical. So no, you would not persevere. You would laugh too loudly, speak when silence was sacred, step across a threshold with your left foot instead of your right. You'd forget to bow. You'd inquire curiously. You'd seek to modify something. And that, in itself, would brand you a threat to order. But therein lies both the brilliance and the sorrow of feudal Japan. It was not constructed for ease. It was constructed for permanence. Its system, though beautiful, was uncompromising. It did not evolve. It endured. And then, amid all of this, we glimpse Artemisia of Korea, a sovereign anomaly, a woman commanding fleets in an era that barely permitted her gender the right to speak. She did not merely defy expectation, she obliterated the blueprint. Historical glitch? Perhaps, but more accurately, a celestial contradiction, one that proved, in rarest form, that history does occasionally blink. And yet, there she stood, enthroned in defiance of expectation, bearing the bifurcated mantle of sovereign and admiral. Artemisia, resolute and radiant, maneuvered not in the shadows of kings, but beside them, strategizing warfare alongside some of antiquity's most formidable men. She presided over Halicarnassus, a fortified polity nestled along the sun-drenched littoral of southwestern Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey. Though nominally subordinate to the sprawling dominion of the Achaemenid Empire, Halicarnassus occupied a liminal position within a mosaic of contested territories, drawn into the perpetual tug of war among greater powers. Yet Artemisia's ascension was no mere inheritance of a ceremonial diadem. It was a reclamation of agency forged in steel. She was Hellenic by blood, Persian by allegiance, and a woman by anatomy, all identities freighted with monumental implication. In a world forged in iron and governed by testosterone. Her father was likely of Carian descent, her mother a native of the island of Crete. Upon the demise of her husband, rather than relinquishing command to a more suitable male heir, Artemisia seized the reins of governance with a serenity that belied its radicalism. That act alone was a muted insurrection. But she was not content to merely reign. She intended to conquer. So, when Xerxes the Great unfurled his grandiose campaign against Greece around 480 BCE, Artemisia committed a transgression her contemporaries would never forget. She volunteered for war, not as a medic, nor a ceremonial presence dispensing blessings from the periphery, but as a naval commander prepared to perish for her convictions. She contributed 5 warships from her own arsenal, sleek, lethal, purpose-built, and led them with her own hand into the very vortex of conflict. And Xerxes, emperor of an empire stretching from the banks of the Indus to the sands of Egypt, did not merely permit her presence, he esteemed it. He sought her counsel. He trusted her voice in a sea of flatterers. It was an audacious gambit. Some deemed it madness. A Hellenic queen enlisting in the service of Persia, tantamount to apostasy. A woman captaining men into war, unfathomable. But Artemisia was no idealist. She played the game of dominion and survival with cold precision, and played it with more acuity than the majority of her male counterparts. In a geopolitical landscape cleaved by swords and governed by patriarchs, Artemisia did not beg for entry. She constructed her own fleet, carved her legacy in the currents of the Aegean, and dared any man to obstruct her. Her alliance with Xerxes was not a mere political convenience. It was a declaration, one that turned her into a pariah among her own people. To the Greeks, she was a gilded traitor, a regal defector who bartered her heritage for influence at a foreign despot's court. But Artemisia remained utterly unshaken. She did not retreat from censure, she leaned into it. She marched into the Persian war room as if it were her birthright, and in many ways it was. Among the bellicose entourage that surrounded Xerxes, commanders whose hands were perpetually stained with blood, Artemisia stood apart. She offered no sycophancy, no platitudes. What she delivered was truth, unvarnished, razor sharp, and strategic. Her words were not decorative. They were directives, and they were rarely miscalculated. On the eve of the fateful Battle of Salamis, she issued a sober admonition: do not engage the Greek navy within the narrow straits. She warned that Persia's numerical advantage would be rendered impotent in such constrained waters. Yet Xerxes, seduced by bombast and hubris, dismissed her prescience. That dismissal would cost him dearly. Even among her ostensible allies, Artemisia remained an anomaly, respected yet begrudged. Many Persian commanders chafed under the ignominy of deferring to a woman. Worse yet, a Greek woman. She had no ornamental role. She did not smile demurely behind curtains. She issued orders, and they were obeyed, often with clenched jaws. Meanwhile, back in Greece, her name spread like an oil stain across silk, fascinating and condemnable. Herodotus himself, hailing from Halicarnassus, documented her with a tone oscillating between reverent intrigue and patriarchal disbelief. He chronicled her as though she were myth, half divine, half damned. To some, Artemisia was a serpent in bronze, Medusa in martial regalia. To others, she was a misunderstood tactician, brilliant, ruthless, and wholly unapologetic for possessing. A mind sharper than the daggers clutched by her detractors, she dared to wield authority, not granted by men, but seized by merit. Artemisia was a mosaic of paradoxes, loyalist and opportunist, tactician and transgressor, iconoclast and imperial confidant. Yet above all, she was a creature of politics, feral, calculating, and unsentimental. She grasped one immutable law of war with terrifying clarity. Identity is malleable, ephemeral. Power alone endures. And if any crucible could lay bare the extent of Artemisia's strategic acumen, it was the cataclysmic confrontation at Salamis. This was no mere skirmish. It was the maritime crescendo of the Greco-Persian conflagration. The Achaemenid fleet, vast in scale and swollen with hubris, bore down upon a vastly outnumbered yet cunningly positioned Greek naval force ensconced within the treacherously narrow straits near Athens. Here, on this bottlenecked stage of chaos, Xerxes' imperial aspirations would unravel, and amid this maelstrom, Artemisia would enact one of the most bewildering, audacious gambits of her storied career. Let us rewind a measure. Artemisia, with prescient precision, had implored Xerxes to refrain from engaging within the confining maritime corridors. Her reasoning was methodical. The Greek ships, nimbler and more intimately acquainted with the maritime topography, would exploit the Persians' lack of maneuverability. Xerxes, however, inebriated on numerical superiority and a thirst for theatrical conquest, rebuffed her. He craved spectacle. What he reaped was debacle. As the battle commenced, disorder tore through the Persian phalanx. Warships collided in disarray. Formations splintered. Greek triremes, sleek and serpentine, darted like predators among leviathans, eviscerating Persian hulls with merciless agility. The result was less a battle than a maritime butcher's yard, and ensnared within this vortex of pandemonium was Artemisia, commanding her flagship with steely poise. Encircled by both comrades and assailants, it was then she executed the maneuver that has bewildered historians for centuries. Pursued by an unrelenting Greek vessel, Artemisia issued a stark and unthinkable command. She ordered her ship to ram a fellow Persian craft, specifically one belonging to an allied monarch. The act was so unforeseen, so unfathomable, that her Greek pursuers assumed she must be an ally in disguise and broke off the chase. In a singular moment of brutal brilliance, she disappeared from the crosshairs, unscathed. From a promontory above, Xerxes observed the chaos below. Supposedly, upon witnessing her maneuver, he turned to his entourage and declared with a mixture of astonishment and rueful admiration, "My men have become women, and my women have become men." Crude by modern sensibilities, but in the lexicon of ancient military culture, it was among the highest forms of praise he ever bestowed, especially upon someone who had just obliterated a friendly vessel to preserve her own command. But Artemisia's gambit was far from mere survivalist instinct. It was calculated deception, battlefield misdirection, and ice-veined logic distilled into a single, astonishing choice. She dissected the chaos around her with tactical clarity, made a decision within heartbeats, and emerged intact, physically and politically. Unorthodox? Yes. Controversial? Unquestionably. But it succeeded. While scores of Persian commanders met their demise or returned in ignominy, Artemisia sailed back not as a scapegoat, but as an anomaly, possibly the sole commander in Xerxes' ranks, to emerge with her credibility unsullied, even enhanced. Amidst wreckage and retreat, she was the one luminous constant, a solitary figure of competence amid an empire's shame. The Persian fleet limped away from Salamis, humiliated, decimated, and stripped of its illusion of maritime dominance. For many, this ignited the empire's decline. For Artemisia, it became a strange coronation. In the ashes of defeat, she ascended, not as an empress, but as the emperor's last trusted oracle. Now ashore, Xerxes was left to grapple with the smoldering remnants of ambition. And in this rare juncture of vulnerability, he turned once more to Artemisia, not as an amusing exception, but as his most dependable strategist. He posed the question none had dared to answer honestly. What now? And Artemisia, with the unflinching directness that had become her trademark, gave him the one counsel no monarch desires: retreat, withdraw, preserve your throne. Let General Mardonius remain to prosecute the campaign. Athens lies in ruin. The point has been made. Do not gamble further with fate. And in a revelation that shocked even his own court, Xerxes obeyed. The autocrat, who had once scoffed at caution, now bent to the insight of a woman, one who had seen the battlefield from within, not from above. Artemisia had not merely survived, she had ascended to a kind of ruthless divinity, neither beloved nor reviled, but undeniably indispensable. She was no heroine by conventional standards, nor a villain in any singular dimension. She was something far more dangerous. She was effective. Her dominion was not forged through the blunt instruments of brute force, but through the piercing edge of lucidity, an attribute disturbingly scarce among sovereigns and warlords alike. In the aftermath of Salamis, Xerxes conferred upon Artemisia a singular trust, the stewardship of his progeny. In antiquity, to entrust one's heirs was no ceremonial gesture. It was a declaration of unwavering faith. Such guardianship bespoke not mere favor, but an affirmation of character, judgment, and incorruptible allegiance. Artemisia, once a peripheral figure, born in a coastal city fraying at the edges of empire, had now insinuated herself into the pulsating heart of imperial dominion. When she returned to Halicarnassus, she did not do so tentatively, cloaked in apprehension or doubt. She arrived as a sovereign of incontestable gravity, a ruler forged in fire, sharpened by war, and burnished by imperial esteem. Her legend began not with proclamations or palatial edicts, but with whispers that refused to die. She was no longer merely a monarch. She had become an emblem, an enigma, etched into the consciousness of empires she had defied again, and then outwitted. Where others pursued security through silence, Artemisia dared the thunder. She waded into conflagration and emerged not scarred, but empowered. Her notoriety, however, did not blossom solely in the smoke of naval sieges. It also flourished in the minds of those who documented the world around them, chief among them Herodotus, the so-called father of history. Herodotus was no disinterested chronicler. Born in Halicarnassus, the very polis over which Artemisia reigned, his pen bore the inescapable imprint of proximity. He was not writing of mythic figures in far-off lands. He was recording the contours of his own queen. Yet Herodotus did not render her as some sanctified ideal of womanhood, nor as a grotesque parody of power. He captured her as something far rarer in the annals of ancient scribes, a leader of authentic consequence, one capable of both compassion and cold calculus. In his account of Salamis, Artemisia is neither villain nor heroine, but something infinitely more compelling, a tactician of eerie precision and lethal foresight. Her decision to annihilate an allied vessel, her serpentine escape, veiled by Greek confusion, these were not born of desperation, but of intellect unencumbered by sentiment. In Herodotus's scrolls, she transforms into a living contradiction, revered and reviled, exalted and scrutinized, but above all, respected. And that respect was not bequeathed by lineage or inherited titles. It was extracted by wit, by nerve, and by a near alchemical mastery of political currents. She dwelt in the colossal shadows of men, Xerxes, Mardonius, and others of insatiable ambition, and yet she eclipsed them where they chased glory, and drowned in its illusion. She glided upon foresight and restraint. She wielded not just weapons, but wisdom, a rarer armament and far more enduring. This, perhaps, is what magnetized Herodotus so relentlessly. Artemisia was incompatible with the preordained categories to which women of her epoch were consigned. She did not rebel through slogans or spectacle, for her age offered no such paradigms. She subverted through excellence alone. She was no feminist. Anachronism forbids the label, but she dismantled patriarchal architecture brick by brick, using competence as her hammer. Her legacy did not ossify in marble effigies or bronze epigraphs. It seeped into story, into memory, into the grudging admiration of men who could not best her. She outmaneuvered them in strategy, outwitted them in counsel, and endured beyond their lifespans through narrative alone. Where their names required the scaffolding of inscription to survive, hers coursed through the oral bloodstream of empire. When Herodotus set down his stylus and re-inked his quill, he was not merely cataloging events. He was transcribing a riddle carved in the silhouette of a queen, and the name, Artemisia, did not vanish with her pyre. Roughly a century hence, it was resurrected, this time embodied by another sovereign, Artemisia II of Korea, a likely descendant and namesake who also governed Halicarnassus. Although the second Artemisia never commanded warships in tumultuous straits, she too etched herself into the fabric of historical grandeur. Her claim to posthumous reverence was no less monumental. She erected one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. a sepulchral marvel fashioned from glistening marble, constructed to immortalize her consort and brother, Mausolus, because dynastic entanglements in antiquity rarely adhered to modern squeamishness. Yet this architectural colossus was not merely an edifice of bereavement. It was an articulation of permanence, a testament to identity wrought in stone, an echo reverberating with the imperious undertone of the first Artemisia's legacy. Even if bloodlines remain indistinct, mother to daughter, aunt to niece, or perhaps nothing more than mythic continuum, the symbolism was unambiguous. By then, Artemisia had evolved into more than a name. It had become a cipher for power, a sigil denoting cunning, resilience, and authority undiluted by gender or tradition. The original queen's heritage was so ingrained in the Harkaras that subsequent generations wore it as a kind of protection. The fact that the later Artemisia's museum gave us the same term we use now for massive tombs is even more endearing. Stone, sorrow, and political drama gave rise to museum, a linguistic legacy, even though the second one, Artemisia, was seen as a time for grief. She also succeeded as a ruler, carrying on the tradition of female leadership in a region of history where it was considered natural. But let's not forget that the first Artemisia, the naval leader, the queen who gave advice, lay the groundwork for all of this. Xerxes, the woman who was both an insider and an outsider in the Greek culture. The call could have waned without her. On a forgotten shore, Harcarus may have been just another lost city. Instead, it has turned into a lighthouse where two strong women made history. Now, not by a stroke of luck, but by boldness. Despite being separated by time, their stories continue to resonate across the years. One had stone, one had ships, and both had names that records were unable to properly bury. The narrative of Artemis has always existed across empires, between sexes, between myth and history. The way her legacy has been contested, twisted, and misinterpreted is the clearest example of this throughout the ages. As others were busy swinging swords, did she turn into a Greek traitor, a Persian puppet, or perhaps a sovereign playing chess? She became a loyal commander to the Persians, one of the few who fought honorably and offered wise counsel. She was perhaps more important to Xerxes than many of his pro-generals. That alone says a lot about her political acumen and poise under duress. Her allegiance was seen as admirable, even heroic in the Persian world. For the Greeks, it became more intricate. She was seen by many as a traitor, someone who had abandoned her Greek heritage to support a needy Japanese person. Nevertheless, even Greek chroniclers, particularly Herodotus, were unable to deny her wit and foxy. In many respects, she became a mirror of their own inconsistencies, demonstrating that not all Greeks supported Greece, and that not all Persians were evil. She clarified the boundaries that conflict sought to establish. There may also be the contemporary perspective, whereby readers and historians continue to debate what she stands for. Before feminism, a feminist icon, perhaps a picture of astute leadership in a world designed to keep her out. In fact, her legacy is still fascinating because she broke the template of historical queens, not because she followed it exactly, She is still often mentioned in nautical historians as an uncommon example of a woman leading a fleet in antiquity in military circles. In a time of arrogance, she is seen as a symbol of purpose in literary and political circles. She also sometimes reappears in well known subcultures, sometimes distorted and occasionally glamorized, but always identifiable. Here's the truth, however. Artemisia didn't give a damn about legacy, no more in the manner that we do. She wasn't writing memoirs or creating a brand. She started pursuing survival, dominance, and victory. And for that reason, her narrative endures. It was not constructed via conceit or myth. It was formed through the use of decisions, difficult, contentious, and more often than not, the right ones. Persia was not her home. Greece was not her home. She was her own property. Artemisia's story did what many great testimonials do. In the end, as the ages passed, it changed. She was no longer only a historical figure. She evolved into a metaphor, a daydream, and sometimes a monster. She was reimagined by writers and dramatists as they saw fit. She became a vicious seductress in several stories. In others, bloodlust was used to possess a warrior queen, layers of myth and terror concealed. The real Artemisia, the strategist, the realist, the survivor, an easy fact contributed to some of this misinterpretation. Men were unsure about how to interpret her, a woman who issued commands, who remained strong in the face of conflict, who told rulers they were wrong and demonstrated it. The ancient global was not pleased with it. So, when faced with a lady they can't handle, storytellers did what they always do. She was rewritten by them. According to one strange narrative, she was deeply in love with a guy who did not reciprocate her feelings, and in her desperation, she pushed herself over a cliff. Although it wasn't really the kind of element a steely naval commander would use, it complemented the story's theme of transforming energy into sorrow. She was portrayed by any other model as a cunning manipulator who was more witch than queen. Throughout history, this pattern has been repeated. Later generations either turn a woman into a villain or turn her into a damsel when she gains energy via intelligence or boldness. Both remedies were administered to Artemisia, but none one honored the occasion. Superstition and seduction were not the ways of the real Artemisia. She ruled with rationality, strategic genius without blood, and imagination and foresight. Using her own rules, she played someone else's game and won. The others who arrived after her were frightened by it more than anything. Because if one woman does it, what stops others from doing the same? Adaptations continue to skew her even in the present era. In 300, The Ascent of an Empire, for example, Hollywood remade her as a vengeance-fueled femme lethal. Fascinating? Yes. Correct? Actually, no. One element, however, is that she continues to draw attention and demand reinvention. Her legacy is fierce. The woman they were afraid of did not pass away. She progressed into illusion, into nostalgia, and into the protracted, unsettling question that history continues to pose. What if more women had modeled themselves like Artemisia? Artemisia of Korea did not disappear from history, but she did disappear from the knowledge. She really changed form. Her legacy spread far after she set sail on her last journey, much like the wake left at the rear of a battleship. Her grave is not marked with a stately tomb. There are no statues of her left in existence. However, her legacy lives on, inscribed on Hickory's bones, muttered within the pages of historical records, and discussed in the halls of every historian who tries to understand how she accomplished the impossibly difficult. For Artemisia's way of life was just that, impossible. She fought in battles when women weren't supposed to fight, and reigned when women weren't supposed to rule, suggested that women should refrain from speaking. Nevertheless, she was heard in one way or another. She wasn't just put up with, she was trustworthy. Her rarest satisfaction may be this: in addition to just surviving the historic world as a woman in energy, she now receives the kind of reluctant adulation that even her adversaries were forced to consider. Her cry is still paradoxical centuries later, exalted and shrouded at the same time. She is no longer the family name that Joan of Arc or Cleopatra have become, but maybe it is. Legend was not pursued by Artemisia. She sought repercussions. She was not adorned with tragic romance or epic beauty. She was a strategist, a realist, and a leader. Poetry was no longer the setting for her drama. Instead, it was the quiet of struggling chambers, the cramped space of a delivery, and the long gaze of a monarch who decided to listen. These days, her story encourages re examination, not only as a story of a woman in a person's world, but also as a reminder that bravery is not necessarily accompanied by a sword or a crown. Occasionally, it hovers on the brink of energy, utters the difficult part, and plunges right into mayhem. There was no need to save Artemisia. There was no need to rewrite her. As she evolved, it will be remembered what she desired and what she still deserves: sharp, dangerous, excellent. She forged her own path through the mists of battle, over unfavorable seas, and towards cultural gravity in a male built kingdom. And Artemisia, of service provider, will never be fully lost as long as ships exist in the world, and history remembers those who dared to speak when it was better to keep quiet. The naked eye and stone were humanity's most efficient tools for discovering the mysteries of the sky before lenses and satellites, before Copernicus ventured to reorganize the universe. And somehow, it was enough. Civilizations throughout history gazed up, not just in awe, but with a purpose. The stars were more than just decoration, they were predictions, gods, calendars, and compasses. Thus began astronomy, the oldest technical knowledge of mankind. Long before it had a name, it evolved into a need. Farmers needed to know when to plant. Persuasion was a skill that sailors needed to master. Priests had to understand when the right ritual should be performed at the right time in the heavens. And each had trustworthy astronomers, sometimes distinguishable from mathematicians, priests, or monarchs. But how did they achieve it without telescopes? They built temples for aesthetic purposes as much as for religion. Massive constructions like the mega pyramids of Meson, the Stonehenge in England, and the Nublier in Egypt were more than just altars or graves. They had been observatories that were carefully synchronized with the solar, lunar, and stellar movements. A lot of them are made to record exact mild patterns on equinoxes and solstices. astronomically inspired building that is sacred. For example, during the summer solstice, the beautiful temple of Amarna at Cranach, Egypt, is oriented such that the sun may push upward precisely between its pylons. At the spring and fall equinoxes, the pyramid El Castillo, constructed by the Maya at Chechnya, creates the illusion of a snake writhing down its stairs. Astronomers in India were able to calibrate the declination of celestial planets with remarkable accuracy because to common stone instruments like the jantar mantar, these weren't wounds. It wasn't a rough guess. Those were intentional, records driven cosmic engineering accomplishments. Additionally, they weren't alone. People have been sinking stone with starlight and constructing with the celebrities in mind everywhere from Babylon to Beijing, from the Andes to the Nile. With nothing but perseverance, assertion, and a profound understanding of cosmic order, they chronicled planetary movements, eclipses, and even retrograde movement. They did more than merely observe the skies. It was measured, charted, and built into the very framework of their cities. Civilizations were already silently and accurately documenting their rhythm in stone long before glass could extend the skies. In the sun-baked food plains of ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians looked up and saw structure instead of just stars. Around 3000 B, they were not explicitly narrating tales about the skies in CE. Around them, they have been structuring their lives. The sky wasn't arbitrary to the Sumerians. It evolved into a cosmic timetable, and their task became to effectively interpret it. The field that we now refer to as celestial mechanics was founded by these early astronomers. They discovered that these movements were not chaotic and discovered that the planets, moon, and sun all moved normally. They had been timepieces. By dividing the 12 months according to the lunar cycle, they developed one of the first calendars ever recognized. It wasn't perfect, but it was very effective in tracking ceremonial and agricultural activities. Regarding time, the Sumerians gave us the sexism machine, but they also included the bottom 60 counting system into our degree of minutes, seconds, and stages. Looking at a clock that displays 60 minutes in an hour or 360 degrees in a circle is akin to a 5,000-year-old way of pondering. They possessed ziggurats, which are step structures that rise toward the sky, but they lacked telescopes. Priest astronomers kept careful records of such systems on clay tablets. Observing Venus as it approached the horizon, the moon becoming crimson during an eclipse, or a celebrity cluster descending after months below the horizon. Umana, their term for these observers, found both spiritual and scientific ones. Sumerian stargazing may develop into something more methodical over time. Their successors, the Babylonians, named stars that are still used today, created enormous celebrity lists and predicted eclipses with uncanny precision. However, it all began when the Sumerians recorded the first astronomical data we have ever discovered by writing out celestial movements in cuneiform. The most remarkable thing about this early science may have been how well it blended with mythology. The sky became both heavenly and predictable to them. You can align your harvests, your rituals, and your destiny if you understand the patterns in which the gods moved. The Sumerians did not just gaze up in wonder, they appeared awake, and began their degree. They so started humanity's protracted courtship with the celebrities. The Babylonians put oil on the main fireplace of astronomy, transforming it into a precise fire if the Sumerians ignited it. By 1800 BC, their dominion had reached its zenith. By CE, Babylonian astronomers were doing more than just observing the sky. They were making predictions about it. With beautiful regularity, eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and retrograde motion are all plotted, recorded, and predicted. They weren't speculating, they have been doing calculations. The Sumerian tradition of observation was enhanced with mathematics by the Babylonians. On clay capsules, recognized today due to the Enuma Anu Enlil and the Maupen, they noted the locations of the moon, planets, and stars. Several of the first known astronomy writings in life, those were not tales for bedtime. The information has been raw, a series of heavenly movements. How long would Venus shine? When may a solar eclipse occur? And when might Venus push upward? These medications served as the industry's first kind of almanac. The best aspect was that they were able to forecast lunacies by using a sample called the Saros cycle, which is a period of around 18 years, after which eclipses recur. They knew it worked, and that was sufficient, even if they did not understand why. Being able to predict celestial activity gave them significant impetus, both religiously and politically, for a manner of life that combined astronomy and divination. The Babylonians really created the zodiac first, despite the fact that the Greeks are usually given credit for it. They created the basis for what would eventually become the zodiac signs that we still use and abuse today by dividing the sky into 12 similar halves, each of which was tied to a constellation. Yes, you may thank Babylon when someone asks for your signal. The audacity of the Babylonians' mathematics, however, is what really distinguishes them. They approximated celestial cycles using mathematical methods and monitored planetary movement, including retrograde routes. It was mathematics that worked, not geometric models, mind you, which would be introduced later by the Greeks, and that became more than adequate for practical functions. They saw the cosmos as a vast machine of recurring cycles, a ledger of patterns. Furthermore, their astronomers weren't only monks or mystics, they were the first scientists, bent over tablets, translating the cosmic rhythms into numbers and symbols. They wrote the sky in the gloom. The ancient Egyptians were actually lowering their whole society to the stars, while the Babylonians were preoccupied forecasting eclipses. Astronomy was more than just a fascination in the Nile Valley. It turned into a matter of survival, and an unmarried star appeared on the coronary heart of everything. The brightest star in the night sky is Sirius. The Egyptians saw something excellent. Sirius may emerge above the horizon around dawn once every 12 months, just before to the yearly flooding of the Nile. Their calendar was built around this occurrence, which they named the helical rise of Sirius. That was significant, not just lyrical. Crop cycles are determined by the Nile's meal waters, and missing that window might result in famine. Thus, a 365-day solar calendar with 5 competition days and 365 days of 30 days was made by the Egyptians. Centuries before Julius Caesar was even mentioned, it got surprisingly close to our modern calendar. However, the Egyptians were unable to halt Sirius. From their temples, many of which had been oriented with stunning astronomical accuracy, they monitored the sun, moon, and stars. For example, the Cranach Temple is oriented to allow the sun to surge upward through its axis immediately at the summer solstice. Various temples are covered with the rising and setting stars, which are revered. The pyramids had been another. The remarkable Pyramid of Giza was built in 2560 BCE, become almost perfectly lined with the cardinal points. Its shafts could also have been oriented towards certain stars, like Sirius and Orion, suggesting a cosmic link between the skies and the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife. This was more than simply a graveyard. Cosmological engineering is what it became. It was common for Egyptian clerics to double as astronomers. They concluded that the sky were best suited for indications and symptoms, omens, and the gods' desires, but not for scheduling rituals. Governance, religion, and astronomy were closely related. To govern Egypt is to comprehend the heavens. It's amazing that they developed a whole system for measuring time, orienting structures, and more without the need of telescopes or even lenses, as well as predicting herbal activity. All of this is mostly dependent on the patient's statement and ongoing accuracy. The Egyptians had no pleasure in looking at the sky. As they awoke, they beheld a holy clock that echoed eternity and ticked with purpose. Long before Europeans ever set foot in the New World deep under the jungles of Meson, the Mer had been building one of the most advanced astronomy systems the sector had ever seen. They tracked the movements of the sun, moon, planets, and stars with an accuracy that still surprises advanced pupils. Despite lacking steel gear, wheels, and telescopes, astronomy was no longer considered a luxury of the erudite elite by the Mer. It evolved into the very structure of civilization. Their rulers were seen as cosmic go-betweens, and every significant religious or political event was synchronized with a corresponding celestial event. There was more to eclipses, solstices, equinoxes, and Venus cycles than just pinpointing them. They served to validate energy. Their observation of Venus was undoubtedly one of their most disheartening accomplishments. The Mayans said that Venus vanished and again resurfaced in the sky in a 584-day cycle, and they incorporated this pattern into their calendar systems and ceremonial conflicts. One of the few pre-Colin books still in existence, the Dresden Codex, has a desk on Venus that charts the planet's movements over countless years with much smaller inaccuracies than sooner or later. There they did not forestall. Dates across hundreds of years may be tracked using the mired long relay calendar. They were astonishingly near to the cutting-edge cost, having a very accurate understanding of the solar 12 months, or around 36,520 days. They had so sophisticated a calendar system that two of them operated at the same time. The lengthy memory for historical chronology, the 365-day solar calendar, the 260-day ritual calendar, Zoltan, and Herb. Additionally, the observatories had stone genius instead of glass domes. The special windows and alignments of the Caracol Observatory at Chechnya enabled Mayan priests to sing the movements of the solar and Venusian planets, similar to the famous snake shadow that creeps down El Castillo during the spring and fall. Temple stairways and shadow results were synchronized with equinoxes. The Maya were not only observing the heavens, they were bringing their civilization up to speed with theirs. Their rulers used the celebrities to dominate. Their conflicts coincided with Venus's wanderings, and their temples rose in tune with the solstices. They did more than just research the universe, they weave it into the fabric of life. Astronomy wasn't only a science in ancient China, it became dependent on the state. The emperor, who seemed to be the son of heaven, ruled with divine approval, a cosmic endorsement that would be withdrawn if the celebrities sent the incorrect message. Astronomy became both political and holy as a result. The dynasty could wish to change if the sky did. As early as the year 2000 B, in the CE, Chinese scientists began keeping a careful record of astronomical events. They documented planetary movements, comets, novae, eclipses, and sunspots. Many of these records, such as those found in the Book of Han and the Sure Facts of the Grand Historian, are nonetheless used today with the assistance of modern scientists to validate historical astronomical events. Their record of a supernova explosion in 1054 CE that was visible throughout the day for 23 days is perhaps the best. Its position was so precisely noted by Chinese astronomers that modern astronomers were able to identify the remains. The Crab Nebula is its current name. However, mystical interpretation was not the only source of China's astronomical skill. They developed mechanical instruments that included gnomes and armillary spheres, as well as rods that cast shadows to determine the locations of stars and the solar height. In fact, centuries before Europe woke up, the Chinese had functioning astronomical clocks and irrigated celestial globes. Chinese astronomers employed the 28 lunar mansions they created from the sky, which were conceptually comparable to Western constellations, for both navigation and timekeeping. In order to establish traditional festivals like the Lunar New Year, they also developed the Chinese language lunar solar calendar, which matched the lunar months with the sun year. The careful documentation of eclipses became one of their major achievements. In addition to forecasting solar and lunar eclipses, they sometimes connected them to dynastic omens. When an eclipse occurred without the emperor being alerted, it was seen as a sign that the astronomers had failed, and sometimes as evidence that the monarch had lost sight of the heavenly mandate. To put it simply, astronomy was not hidden away in a student's test in China. It was fundamental to national existence, government, and spirituality. The stars were unable to simply tell the time. The empire paid attention to their advice on truth. Astronomy in ancient India did not develop into a distinct discipline. It became entwined with metaphysics, mathematics, philosophy, and ritual. Indian astronomy, often referred to as geosocial science, began as a tool for determining the best times for ceremonies, but evolved into one of the most statistically sophisticated systems of observing the heavens in history. The Veds, which were written circa 1500 BCE, include the oldest mentions of cosmic phenomena. These holy books identify the cycles of the sun, moon, and planets, as well as the division of the sky into 27 nakshatras, or lunar mansions, which served as the foundation for early Indian sky charting. These nakshatras were connected to every calculation and story. Despite being the foundation of astrological charts and calendars, they are still used in India today. However, Indian astronomy was more than simply poetry. It became startlingly accurate. Historical academics developed solar year patterns that were more accurate than the Julian calendar, which the Romans introduced much later, centuries before Newton. The axial tilt of the Earth, the elliptical orbits of planets, and even the concept of gravity are all described in the Surya Vedanta, a fundamental astronomical work that was composed about 500 CE based on prior knowledge. Aryabhata, who in 499 CE postulated that the Earth revolves on its axis day by day, a theory that was seldom accepted in other parts of the globe at the time, may have been the most influential modern figure in Indian astronomy. In addition, he gained sophisticated trigonometry skills to aid in astronomical computations and determined the duration of the sun's 12 months to be 365.358 days, just a little deviation from modern numbers. In addition, Indian astronomers developed complex signs and symptoms, worked with decimal notation, and employed spheres and shadow units to measure heights and angles. Observations were routinely timed to coincide with planetary conjunctions, solstices, and equinoxes. However, Indian astronomy had a cosmic grace that went beyond technical accomplishments. The cosmos was more than a device. It evolved into a cycle, an infinite dance of space and time. Dominating nature was not the goal of astronomy. It turned become a matter of harmony. According to the Indian perspective, seeing the skies has become a way of knowing oneself. It is a geometry of spirit in which planets travel not only across the sky, but through the soul. The ancient Greeks glanced skyward and asked why other cultures turned to the sky for guidance, ritual, or survival. What causes the celebs to flow? Planets wander. Why? Most importantly, is it possible to use causation to define the universe? The connection between humans and the skies underwent a sea change. With the advent of Greek astronomy, the Greeks looked for rules, while others saw patterns and portents. They were more than just onlookers. They had been theorists attempting to utilize geometry, philosophy, and mathematics to decipher the sky. One of the first to propose that natural principles might account for heavenly occurrences was Thales of Mitsu. Then came an Alexander who suggested that the heavens form a spherical and pictured the earth floating in space without any support. These concepts may perhaps seem crass in the modern day, yet they were advanced at the time. The real bounce came with Pythagoras, who saw the universe as a device of perfect harmony, a system of spheres controlled by mathematical ratios. His supporters laid the groundwork for theoretical astronomy by thinking that the world could be comprehended via numbers. Aristarchus of Samos, however, came the nearest to fashionable reality. According to his heliocentric theory, which he put forward in the 3rd century BCE, the Sun, and not Earth, would serve as the universe's center. Despite being ignored for over 2 millennia, his theories sowed the seeds that would eventually bear fruit with Copernicus. Hippos, the founder of observational astronomy, arrived next. He noticed the equinoxes' precession, made the first stellar catalog, separated stars by on brightness, and invented trigonometric tools to determine the locations of celestial bodies. Especially without telescopes, his precision became astounding. Finally, there was Claudius Ptolemy, whose writings for more than 1,000 years have all but established the standard for astronomy. He used Greek, Babylonian, and Egyptian knowledge to create a geocentric version that used epiclesis and deference, a sophisticated but intricate mechanism that worked until it didn't, to explain planetary movement. Their commitment to logical justification and methodical modeling changed the game, despite the fact that certain Greek ideas had proven incorrect. They explained to the stadium that the stars weren't just at random, rather, they were governed by styles that people should be able to identify. Astronomy has become more than just a statement with the Greeks. It has turned into a conflict between the sky and the ground, between reality and illusion, and between what we can see and what we can identify. Humanity had already spent many years observing the heavens with little more than eyes, shadows, and stone by the time the telescope was created in the early 17th century. However, the achievements of those ancient civilizations are far from spectacular. Without the use of lenses, satellites, or electricity, they plotted stars, monitored planets, predicted eclipses, and erected monuments in accordance with the solstices and equinoxes. Their achievements are all the more impressive since they were accomplished on their own. The sophisticated astronomical systems of the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, the Maya in Mesopotamia, the Chinese and Indians in Asia, and the Greeks and Egyptians in the Mediterranean were all based on their unique worldviews. However, despite the fact that they were oceans, they reached similar findings. The sequence in which the heavens revolve is important. Astronomy in the past was not limited to ivory towers. It influenced philosophy, politics, structure, religion, and agriculture. It determined when to build, when to worship, when to plant, and when to reign. Every society began to see the sky as a way to learn about the divine, or at the very least, one's place within the vast machinery of life. A profound, unchanging regard for the universe was a common characteristic throughout their many models, some of which were geocentric, some legendary, and others cyclical. The sky served as more than just a background for many ancient peoples. It became planned, holy, and living. At some point, the telescope may change everything. It showed us Jupiter's moons, Venus's phases, sunspots, and galaxies that were far away from Earth. However, the ancients' foundation, meticulous charting, methodical record keeping, and unwavering curiosity. Every time we glance at a calendar, use a phone app to map the celebrities, or commemorate a solstice, we continue on their legacy today. They established the groundwork for every GPS, satellite, and space project using papyrus, stone, and clay. They were unable to comprehend cosmic microwave backgrounds or black holes. They did, however, ask the right questions. They seemed to be awake and cognizant, in the dark, without being aware of it. They were the earliest scientists. They diligently and silently penned their queries in the sky. And because of them, we are able to go deeper, not simply into space, but also into our own roots. In 1803, an extraordinary event occurred. In a single day, a nascent republic that was just 3 years old sold a landmass so large that it doubled in size. The acquisition of Louisiana was more than simply a real estate transaction. It became a thunderclap of geopolitics. From the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, France gave the United States more than 828,000 rectangle miles of territory with a single stroke of the pen. This vast, rich land may eventually give birth to 13 new republics. Additionally, the fee is a cool $15 million, or around 4 cents per acre. However, what's even more amazing is that nobody, not even the people themselves, saw it coming. President Thomas Jefferson's only goal at the time was to have easy access to the Mississippi River and the strategically important port city of New Orleans. The fledgling nation became largely reliant on river trade. In the Ohio Valley, farmers were forced to ship their goods south, and the keys to economic survival were in the hands of whomever controlled New Orleans. Jefferson authorized diplomats to give France as much as $10 million for New Orleans and a few other territories. That's it. However, the ambassadors were taken by surprise when they arrived. The French provided a response. The whole Louisiana region, not just New Orleans. Why? Priorities in France changed under Napoleon Bonaparte. The Haitian Revolution had defeated French aims in the Caribbean, but Napoleon still aimed for a vast North American dominion. Disease, insurrection, and growing hostilities with Britain made holding on to Louisiana more difficult than it was ultimately worth. Napoleon wanted money for war, not prairies and marshes. When confronted with an unexpected prospect, the Yankee negotiators said, "Sure, Speedy," even before receiving Jefferson's complete permission. Nevertheless, this was more than a port. The Mississippi River, the magnificent plains, the entrance to the Rocky Mountains, and fate ruled over the continent's central region. It was more than simply land that Jefferson gained. It turned into the future, a blank canvas for national prosperity, westward expansion, and inevitable strife. However, one truth was forgotten when journalists were celebrating. This land is no longer vacant. Numerous indigenous foreign regions, each with its own history, alliances, and claims, already called it home. Therefore, a Paris Agreement could suddenly control lives over a whole continent, not just alter maps. Napoleon Bonaparte, a guy with a crown and a headache, stood on the Louisiana Buy's coronary heart. The French monarch was blocking on too many fronts in 1803, including in his own finances, the Caribbean, and Europe. He therefore promised to sell out a third of North America to the United States, which he had previously hoped to keep from continental energy, in a move that startled almost everyone who was concerned. That wasn't how it had begun. Louisiana had been covertly acquired by France from Spain under the auspices of the Treaty of Sanil only a few years before. Restoring a French colonial empire was one of Napoleon's lofty objectives. Louisiana would provide wheat, meat, and other resources to Sanding, the gem in the crown of France's Caribbean territories, now known as Haiti. Louisiana wasn't necessary for France. It desired to aid sugar. However, that image vanished in fever and fireplace. Under the leadership of former slaves, such as Toussaint Lavatory, the Haitian Revolution had burst into full-scale rebellion. To weigh it down, France sent tens of thousands of soldiers who were then killed by the piles, not only from fighting, but from yellow fever. Napoleon lost his military might, his first-class widespread, and his risk to retake the world's wealthiest sugar colony. As Saint-Amand faded, Louisiana was rendered unsuitable. If not irrelevant, it could no longer be justified. Napoleon was also concerned that Louisiana would likely be seized under pressure as Britain prepared for another conflict with France. Therefore, he provided it rather than preventing it from being maintained. And the decision became quick, audacious, and entirely practical. In typical Napoleonic form, he made a recommendation that startled American ambassadors James Monroe and Robert Livingston on April 11th, 1803. $15 million for all of Louisiana, not just New Orleans. Napoleon's logic became simple. I've given England a competitor in the sea that will at last make her enjoy herself. He needed more than just money. He wanted us to become strong enough to confront Britain. There was no surrender on selling Louisiana. It turned into a plan. Therefore, Napoleon transformed the destiny of a commoner he hardly valued and abandoned his American kingdom in a single move. What he considered an imperial afterthought would serve as the springboard for the expansion of the United States westward and the beginning of the end of native sovereignty across the continent. An agrarian republic, a country of self-sufficient farmers living on their own land and bound together by liberty and civic virtue, was the long-held dream of Thomas Jefferson. Either the Louisiana acquisition caused him a constitutional nightmare, or it was his fantasy come true. Jefferson became an inflexible builder. According to him, the federal government should only use the authority expressly provided by the charter. And what would you bet? That agreement made no mention of U.S. officials being able to buy land elsewhere. No provision for buying a whole continent or a jail street plan that would double the size of the nation in a single purchase has been included. Jefferson paused. Napoleon's offer was almost too accurate to be true. $15 million for territory that stretches from the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi. Jefferson struggled with the conflict, but it gradually became a possible in a society. As someone who was concerned about government overreach, should he use the charter to support such a large purchase? In private, he thought of proposing a constitutional change to approve the purchase. However, political realities loomed and the clock started to tick. Napoleon would change his mind if he waited, or Britain might seize the area before the ink had a chance to dry. Jefferson thus took an ironic action. Years before, he had chastised Alexander Hamilton for supporting implied powers, which he now supported. He justified the purchase as a treaty that the president may make with the Senate's consent under the charter. In October 1803, the agreement was overwhelmingly approved by the Senate. Jefferson justified his choice as essential to the Republic's existence and security, despite his secret uneasiness. Thus, the most significant, nonviolent land purchase in U.S. history was designed by Jefferson, the constitutional purist. His detractors, who labeled him a hypocrite, weren't wrong to point the finger at him for the discrepancy. However, Jefferson saw it as a necessary compromise that, in his opinion, bent the charter in order to save rather than harm the Republic. He established a precedent in doing so. Even in the absence of explicit constitutional power, the federal government may choose to acquire property by treaty, and this precedent may be repeatedly used as the U.S. pushed westward and into areas that had previously been inhabited by people. They signed, sealed, and confirmed the Louisiana Purchase. But nobody quite understood what the U.S. had just purchased. The region was sizable, somewhat explored, and teeming with unidentified animals, rivers, and mountains. In 1804, President Jefferson ordered the Corps of Discovery, an expedition headed by William Clark and Meriwether Lewis that may end up being one of the most famous voyages in American history. Their endeavor became formidable: investigate the new area, establish a trade agreement with indigenous nations, examine the riches on the land, and, above all, find a waterway leading to the Pacific Ocean, a northwest passage, a navigable connection between the Atlantic and Pacific that might transform change, was Jefferson's ideal. It didn't exist. Spoiler alert. Lewis and Clark's discoveries, however, have the potential to change how people see their position on the continent. With a company of more than 30 men, they began their journey in St. Louis in 1804 and proceeded upriver into territory that had not yet been settled by Americans. They discovered 178 new plants and more than 100 new animal species along the way. They drew mountains, traced rivers, and meticulously documented their anthropological and scientific discoveries in journals. They didn't accomplish it alone, however. A young Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, who accompanied her French-Canadian husband on the day excursion, emerged as one of the adventure's most important characters. Sacagawea evolved beyond his role as a translator. She was a picture of tranquility. Native tribes were alerted that she was no longer a war group by her appearance with a child. Her knowledge of foreign diplomacy and geography enabled the Corps to forge crucial partnerships and survive perilous crossings. Almost the course of 2 years, the expedition covered almost 8,000 meters on foot, on horse, and by boat. In November 1805, they arrived to the Pacific Ocean, constructed a stronghold to withstand the cold, and then traveled back east in 1806. Although they were unable to locate a northwest passage, they did bring back something that may be considered far more valuable: a detailed description of the recently acquired territory and its inhabitants. A mystery had been purchased by Jefferson. Lewis and Clark began to bring it to life. However, their stories also hinted at something worse, even as they stoked hopes of westward expansion. The impending strain on native nations and the unavoidable drive toward invasion under the pretext of discovery. The Louisiana acquisition was seen by American politicians and people as a land grab, a blank canvas for towns, farms, and aspirations. The indigenous peoples who had inhabited the area for millennia, however, saw it as something very different: the start of the erasure. More than 50 independent indigenous nations, each with its own language, territory, and system of government, now call the country the U.S. had purchased from France home. Long before any ECU flag had been planted, the Jones Sioux, Cheyenne, Comanche, and Menden were among the societies that had been managing the land, engaging in trade, and forming alliances. However, The Louisiana area was seen by Jefferson and other U.S. officials as a vast, underutilized, and fertile ground for American habitation. The contract no longer includes consultation with the local foreign residents. No notice was given to them. They received no payment. They were independent peoples once. Following that, they were proclaimed subjects of the growing American Republic. Jefferson thought that locals might either move quietly, if at all possible, or by force if necessary, or they could adapt into American civilization. He said in private correspondence that native people may either travel west with the settlers or die. Although it wasn't called elimination, the idea was already taking shape. Following the Lewis and Clark Day excursion, which revealed a richness of land and herbs, this pressure increased in order to claim property and drive tribes farther west. The federal government began drafting treaties, many of which were misleading or coercive. Navy forces supported these operations in a few cases. In others, the task was done by chaos and dislocation. The acquisition of Louisiana signaled the start of a new phase of U.S. expansion. Before it received a call, the future was manifest. This transaction and its moral cost in the lives and territories of neighboring countries served as the foundation for the idea that America had been destined to rule the continent. Native Americans no longer see the Louisiana Purchase as a transaction. A trespass was committed. It eliminated borders that had never been discussed, redrew maps that had never belonged to them, and brought in a flood of people who came here to take rather than to change. And that wave was only just getting started. The peaceful acquisition of Louisiana, that almost quadrupled the size of the United States, was heralded as a victory. On paper, the land sale was flawless, but in practice, things turned out differently. Growth came at a cost, one that is being paid in hardship, uprooting, and cultural devastation rather than wealth. American settlers began moving westward when the newly acquired country was secured. They moved into areas still inhabited by indigenous peoples, motivated by the promise of financial opportunity, public freedom, and abundant agriculture. In order to maintain control and enforce its new power, the federal authorities organized highways, administrative stations, and forts. This created the conditions for two conceptions of the country to collide slowly and fiercely. One saw it as property to be had and promoted, while another viewed it as a living thing to be shared and honored. Conflict naturally arose. Conflicts escalated into wars. After being signed, the treaties had been ruined. With the help of railroads, firearms, and unwavering desire, the borderline gradually advanced westward. However, indigenous tribes were not the only ones that had to pay a fee. Slavery, another moral dilemma that the Louisiana Territory exacerbated, had the potential to eventually split the country. The large additional areas were immediately seen by Southern officials as a chance to expand plantation agriculture. In the southern regions of the region, cotton and sugar flourished, and it was evident that enslaved labor was essential to making it valuable. This posed a provocative question. Would slavery be permitted in the newly acquired lands? Congress would be plagued with the response for decades: sectional tensions, the Missouri Compromise, and ultimately the Civil War were the results of it. The Louisiana Purchase extended beyond the boundaries of the United States. It strained its political fabric to the limit. There were other repercussions on the ecosystem. The grasslands were cultivated, the rivers were dammed, and the buffalo were almost exhausted. In the end, the change was swift and permanent. A patchwork of farms, fences, and commercial extraction have replaced the landscape that was previously created by fireplaces, herds, and indigenous guardianship. America also acquired the burden of its accomplishments when it seized the country, a legacy that continues to be discussed in discussions about reparations, tribal sovereignty, and land rights. The actual cost is still being paid, even though the land may also be bought. After the Louisiana transaction was finalized, a fresh query surfaced. How exactly do you manage an area that is so important that it fosters creativity? From Louisiana to Montana, and from the Dakotas to Colorado, the area covered what would eventually become all or a portion of 15 innovative USA territories. But in 1803, it transformed into an ill-defined desert, full with opportunities, but with few roads, no settlements, and many conflicting claims. Mapping out boundaries, rivers, mountains, and eventually asset traces became the initial stage in the surveying process. The foundation was established by expeditions such as those headed by Zebulon Pike, Lewis, and Clark, and others. Following them were army engineers, land speculators, and orographers who created maps that eventually became state boundaries, county lines, and reserves. What was once an open and interwoven indigenous world is now being cut into rectangular pieces in order to establish the territory, first as military districts and then as planned territories, with governors chosen via the federal government. Congress went beyond the law. Through the Northwest Ordinance, the new governing bodies were able to observe the sample. A territory may apply for statehood whenever it has enough inhabitants, although not all boundaries have been chosen fairly or with sound judgment. Missouri became the first nation to be created out of the acquisition in 1821. Missouri intended to allow slavery. Thus, its admittance caused a national controversy. Throughout the acquisition, an imaginary boundary was drawn by the Missouri Agreement that resulted. Slavery would be prohibited in the North and permitted in the South, with each new kingdom reputation threatening to upset the balance between the North and the South. That unmarried line might plague American politics for decades. White settlers, sometimes ahead of the law, swarmed into the new areas in the meanwhile through squatting, preemption, and ever more government-funded property offers. They asserted their claim to land. The local population, even those with existing treaties, discovered that their land had been suddenly redefined, first as land, then as open space, and last as someone else's farm. Additionally, they had been deleting maps as they were being crammed in, removing native names, local pathways, and seasonal migrations in favor of names like Baton Rouge, Jefferson City, and Fort Pierre. In this new conception of the United States, borders were more than just lines drawn on a map. They have served as instruments of control, strategies to make claims, create divisions, and advance and rule over territory that had, until recently, belonged to no president, no state, and, to be honest, no empire. The Louisiana Purchase altered the United States' identity rather than just changing its boundaries. The United States transformed from a coastal republic embracing the Atlantic to a continental powerhouse embracing the future with a single diplomatic move. It set the stage for the next century of development, conquest, and reinvention, and was the first remarkable leap into the future, occurring even before the time period existed. Politically, the purchase established a precedent that federal authorities may choose to use treaties to acquire more property without clear constitutional guidance. With Florida, Texas, Oregon, Alaska, and Hawaii, that precedent would be applied again. Today, the United States is more than just a nation. It is a kingdom that is constantly expanding westward. It nourished a new kind of American myth, the frontier on a cultural level. Testimonies of hardy pioneers, fearless explorers, and boundless potential were placed against the background of the Louisiana Territory. But there has been a native nightmare for every pioneer's fantasy, a recollection of lost territory, breached agreements, and people forced into exile. The impact became tremendous from an economic standpoint. American commerce grew centered on the Mississippi River. Cities like Kansas City, New Orleans, and St. Louis developed become important centers of trade. Farmland replaced fertile plains, and the discovery of gold, silver, and other natural resources might convert large amounts of the acquisition into sources of industrial growth. The broader legacy, however, is contradictory. The purchase reflected American values. It represented the United States' private tragedies, dispossession, slavery, and imperial ambition. But it also represented opportunity, progress, and independence, written on land that was seized from others, sometimes with violence. It is a tale of victory. Tens of millions of people now live in the states that make up the Louisiana Purchase outline. Where buffalo used to wander, highways now intersect. Where, previously, there were hallowed places, there are now wheat fields. However, the memory of that purchase endures under the dirt and asphalt, not just as a transaction, but also as a pivotal moment. It permanently altered the United States of America. Become the sector, then. However, the question still stands. Was the cost in monetary terms? Or was it, as many would later contend, defined by lives, cultures, and scenery that could never be purchased back? The Louisiana Purchase ultimately turned out to be more than just a property purchase. The change in American identity from a shaky republic clinging to the eastern shore to an empire in the making that boldly stretches into the heartland became a defining moment. The ramifications reverberated across generations, rivers, and plains. Even while the ink dried in Paris, it symbolized possibility for America. It inspired a new sense of confidence in the country, a belief that expansion was no longer just feasible, but also unavoidable. In the end, that view would push us toward the Pacific Ocean and beyond, solidify into policy, and become fate. It also solidified an energy model based on improvement, displacement, and land acquisition. The West is no longer a suspenseful story. It became an object of desire. Additionally, it was a platform for politicians, speculators, and settlers to seize possibilities by uprooting what was already in place. The move turned into a catastrophe for the home nations. The territory they had fought for, lived on, traded across, and celebrated suddenly became theirs through a faraway government that claimed to have sold it rather than an invading military. Nothing has been discussed or agreed upon, just a new set of rules and a line on a map. Cycles of violence, forced relocation, and cultural destruction were hastened by the arrival of American settlers. Reservations were drawn, and treaties came and went. Languages were diminished, and bison had been killed. Although they were not completely eradicated, the native population in the Louisiana region had been significantly reduced, muted, or eradicated by the time the dust cleared. However, the purchase's legacy remains multi-layered. The infrastructure, economy, and cities that sprang from it contributed to the development of modern-day America. The rivers it provided turned into vital conduits. Its herbal supplies supported the expansion of industry. Innovation, variety, and reinvention were made possible by the space it created. Still, the specter of that transaction remains. These days, the Louisiana acquisition is seen as a contradiction, a daring diplomatic triumph, and a displacement model. It's a story of success and sorrow, of aspiration and forgetfulness. It not only shaped who we are now, but it also compelled a reckoning that is still going on today. How can you find joy in a place you never asked for and may never ever see again?